not aware of that, check out anyone who is any blogs or anything that is written about what's going on in China. So this idea of a king saying, we're not real thrilled with what you're doing, Paul, so we're going to jail you. That doesn't really resonate with us because that kind of thing doesn't happen in this country. But for Paul, this was very real. The church is just getting started there in Philippi, and Paul's been in jail a number of times, and there are a lot of questions because the king has seen Paul and his message and his God as a threat to the Roman Empire. And so they said, you know what, we're throwing this guy in jail. We're not dealing with this. We're not having this happen. And so the church is left in kind of a lurch without a real strong leader. Their leader is in jail. And so Paul writes this letter of encouragement to them, and you can see the encouragement that kind of flows out of this in the first few verses of chapter 1 in Philippians. That he is encouraging them, hey, you have been on mission, you have been on task, you are doing great things in the name of Jesus Christ. So it is an encouragement to that church in Philippi. Now we don't have kings that are coming down into, the mayor isn't coming in the back door and saying, we're not doing this, you all disperse and you leader, you're going to jail. That kind of thing isn't happening here, right? But there are other kinds of kings that kind of step to the forefront. Other things that threaten us. How about the kings of finance? And there's a major discussion about how to bail out America, basically, right? And the king of finance has said to a lot of people, hey, because of the nature of what we are dealing with right now, you're financially going to get toothed right now. You're going down the toilet. So the king of finance is very intimidating. How about the king of the economy that says, well, you haven't lost your retirement, but you are paying way, way too much for gas. You're paying way too much to heat your home. It is costing you way too much to provide for the things that we kind of take for granted and that we've always had. So the king of the economy is intimidating. How about the king of terminal or long-term sickness? We all know people that, and maybe it's us, that we are struggling on an ongoing basis with a sickness that is debilitating and is preventing us from living the kind of lives that we want to live. Those kind of kings are intimidating. And they carry with them a lot of threats. They bring doubt into our lives, right? Recognize any of those kings in your life? You may be thinking of other kings that are kind of creeping in and stealing the joy that you're supposed to live with as one who is in relationship with Christ. Something very interesting that Paul writes here. This is right away in verse 3. Paul writes about a personal God. He says, my God, I thank my God for you every time I think of you. My God, he becomes very personal. Now, I think what is very interesting, the older I get, the more I recognize this, and you may have already realized this, but this is kind of an epiphany for me, a wake-up for me. The older I get, the more I realize that times change, people in general do not. They, in the first century, are dealing with the same kinds of things that we are. It looks a little bit different than first century, but it's the same kind of junk. In first century life, one of the things that they dealt with was the fact that there was this general appreciation of God in general, small g. That there were gods all over the place, and we can talk about God, and we can have conversations about God, and we can even worship God. But Paul does something very interesting. He says, my God. He makes it personal. We have the same struggles today. You can be standing around the water cooler or sitting at the lunch table, and people can immediately turn into a spiritual conversation pretty quick because our culture is loaded with spiritual stuff. Not necessarily godly stuff, not necessarily stuff that's focused on Christ, but spiritual stuff. And the conversation can be, God, I like God, and I love God, and God did this for me, and God, blah. And you have the opportunity when you are involved, and you're maybe hearing that conversation, to make it personal. To use Paul's language. My God did this for me. My God has taken care of me. My God has healed people, and there is evidence of it running around my church every week when I'm there. Now, one of the problems is, this becomes, well, first of all, let's be honest, that intimidates some of us a great deal, right? To jump out and to take a leap and say, I'm going to talk about my God at the workplace. When I'm not even sure if there are other Christians sitting around this table or gathered around the water cooler. So for some of us, that is extremely intimidating. I would fall into that category. I think it's hard. Just my personality makeup says it is hard to talk about how great God is at times. There are times that it just kind of flows out of us, right? But there are as many times that it's difficult. I think that becomes a real important mission for us. Now, understand, just because I work at church and I'm one of your staff people for this church, doesn't mean that the Christian life for me is any easier than it is for you. My calling is just a little bit different than yours. My workplace is just a slight bit different than yours. So this can be intimidating. But if you step out onto that ledge and you say, my God did this for me that last week, and my God, I have a personal relationship with my God. Now there might be a couple people who would kind of say, well, that sounds kind of interesting. I think I might like to talk a little bit. They might not use those words. But that is what they are basically sharing is, that sounds interesting. I am at least a little bit intrigued. But there will be other people sitting at the table saying, wow, good luck with that, Bob. I got to go see a guy about a thing. And they'll leave. Right? Because this becomes intimidating. When you start talking about a God who created the universe and He cares about me and He cares about you, there will be some people who will flip the switch and shut it down and say, I don't want to be a part of this at all. You may be thrown into ridicule that you had not previously been a part of. That is a king of the false God, a king of a God who is not personal and seeks to thrust doubt and intimidation into our hearts and into our minds. So the first century is very much like what we experience today, isn't it? In the 21st century. It's so easy to become impersonal and not talk about what God has done in our lives. And if that is part of your story you're not sure about, I would really challenge you. Start praying this week, saying, all right, God, I am struggling with how to share the personal nature of my relationship with you. Help me do that. God does not disappoint. He does not ignore the prayers of his children, His sons and daughters. We already have acknowledged that today. That even though God is this big, He's interested in this small, in us. So Paul's prayer, he begins with something very interesting, I think. Paul begins with love. If you look, I think it's in verse 9, that Paul begins talking about this issue of love. And this is my prayer for you, that your love may abound. I think it's very interesting and almost difficult that Paul begins with love. What would we begin with? Let's go back to our idea that we started with. If we closed the doors next week, or we had a special closed door meeting where we weren't inviting any new folks, what would we say? What did you write on your papers? Look at your papers. What did you write on your pages? What would you be willing to talk about? I think for a lot of us, we would